The chains around my wrists were still warm from the last person who wore them. I did not know his name. I only knew he was gone, and now it was my turn to stand on the metal platform while creatures with gray skin and black eyes decided how much I was worth. Somewhere above me, alarms began to scream through the palace walls, and every guard in the room froze at once. I remember thinking, whatever is happening up there, it must be bad, because these things never freeze. My name is Ethan Caro. 6 months ago, I was a cargo pilot flying a routine supply run between 2 mining stations. Now I was property, chained in the auction pens beneath the throne of Queen Aelthara, ruler of the Vraxil Empire, one of the largest powers in known space. I had learned to survive by staying quiet, by watching, by never standing out. That was about to change, though I did not know it yet. The alarms cut out as suddenly as they started. A voice came through the speakers built into the stone walls, deep and layered, the kind of voice that had been trained since birth to command obedience. It was the Queen herself. "Citizens of the Vraxil Empire," she said, "the Kesh Dominion has broken through our defenses at the 6th ring." The room went silent. Guards who had been laughing moments earlier now stood rigid, their weapons gripped tighter. Around me, other captives shifted in their chains, confused, afraid, unsure what any of this meant for people like us, who owned nothing, not even our own bodies. I had heard of the Kesh Dominion before, in whispered conversations between guards who thought we could not understand their language, though most of us had learned enough to follow along. The Kesh were not like the Vraxil. The Vraxil ruled through fear and tradition, through auctions and chains and a strict order of who commanded who. The Kesh ruled through erasure. Wherever the Kesh Dominion conquered, nothing of the old world remained. No auctions, no captives, no history. Just silence, and new flags, and empty streets. I did not know which was worse, yet. The Queen's broadcast continued, and for the first time since I had arrived in this palace, I heard something in her voice that did not belong there, something almost human, fear. "Our fleets have fallen back," she said. "The 6th ring cannot hold another attack. I say this not to frighten you, but because you deserve the truth. We are losing this war." A murmur rose through the auction hall, quickly silenced by the crack of a guard's staff against the floor. I kept my eyes down, the way I always did, but my mind was racing. If the Vraxil Empire fell, what happened to us? Did the Kesh free the captives, or did they erase us, along with everything else? I looked up just enough to see the holographic projection above the auction stage flicker to life. It showed the Queen's throne room, and there she sat, tall and pale, with eyes the color of deep water. Aelthara was young for a Vraxil monarch, only recently crowned after her mother's passing, and I had heard the guards say she was too soft for the throne, too quick to hesitate before giving orders that would cost lives. Watching her now, I did not see softness. I saw someone carrying a weight too large for her shoulders, trying not to let it show. "The Kesh envoy will arrive within the day," she continued. "They have requested terms of surrender." The room erupted again, and this time the guards did not bother trying to silence it. Even they were afraid. I felt something shift inside my chest, a small and stubborn thing I had buried since the day I was captured. Anger. Not at the Vraxil, though I had every reason to hate them, not even at the Kesh, who I had never met. I was angry at the idea that everyone around me, powerful beings who commanded fleets and empires, had already decided the war was over before a single shot was fired in this room. I was angry that once again people like me, chained and voiceless, would simply be handed to whoever won, like furniture passed between owners. The broadcast ended, and the auction hall descended into a strange, tense quiet. Guards spoke to each other in low voices. Captives whispered questions no one could answer. I stood there, chains cutting lightly into my wrists, and I watched the Queen's face linger in my memory. She had known the cameras were on her. She had known every conquered world watched her admit defeat. And still, for one brief moment before the broadcast ended, I had seen her glance towards something off-screen. Not at a general, not at an advisor, at the captives, at us. I did not understand it then, but I would come to learn that Aelthara did not fear death. Vraxil monarchs were raised from childhood to accept the possibility of dying in service to the Empire. What she feared was what would happen to everyone beneath her, the servants, the workers, the captives, the ordinary people who never asked for war and never got a vote in how it ended. She had seen what the Kesh Dominion left behind on other conquered worlds. Nothing. Not cruelty, not slavery, not even memory. Just silence. A guard grabbed my arm and shoved me back into a holding cell, canceling the auction for the day. I did not resist. I had learned that resisting only ever made things worse, and besides, my mind was elsewhere, replaying that broadcast over and over. The cell was small, carved from gray stone, with a narrow slit of a window too high to reach. I sat on the cold floor and listened to the muffled sounds of the palace outside, guards moving in a hurry, voices raised, something being prepared, war preparations probably, or surrender preparations. I could not tell the difference anymore. A woman in the cell beside mine spoke through the wall, her voice barely above a whisper. Her name was Grace Holloway, another captive, taken from a colony ship 3 years earlier. She had been here long enough to understand the rhythms of this place better than I did. "You heard the broadcast," she said. It was not a question. "Everyone heard it," I answered. "They're going to surrender," Grace said. "I've seen it before, on the smaller feeds. The Kesh have taken 12 systems in the last 2 years. Nobody stops them. What happens to us if they win?" Grace was quiet for a long moment. "Nobody knows. That's the frightening part. Nobody who's been through it ever tells anyone what happens next. The signals just go quiet." I stared at the stone ceiling, feeling the weight of that silence settle over me like a blanket made of ice. I thought about my life before all this. The small mining station where I used to deliver supplies, the friends I would never see again, the family who probably assumed I was dead by now. I thought about the Queen's face on that broadcast, the fear she had tried and failed to hide completely. And I thought about the moment right before the feed cut out, when her eyes had drifted toward the captives. I did not know why that small detail stuck with me so strongly. Maybe it was because in 6 months of captivity, no Vraxil noble had ever looked at us as anything more than property to be counted and sold. Maybe it was because, for just a heartbeat, I had seen something in her expression that looked almost like an apology. Whatever it was, it planted a seed in my mind that night, one I could not shake no matter how hard I tried to sleep. Somewhere above these cells, an empire was preparing to fall, and everyone inside these walls, guards and captives alike, was about to be swept into whatever came next, whether we wanted it or not. I did not sleep well that night. None of us did. Through the walls I could hear other captives whispering in languages I did not recognize, some crying quietly, others simply silent in a way that felt heavier than any sound. Fear moves through a place like that, seeping into stone and steel until it becomes part of the architecture itself. Near what I guessed was early morning, though there were no true windows to tell time by, the guards came for the entire block of cells. Not just me, not just Grace, all of us. Dozens of captives pulled from our cells and marched down a long corridor lit by pale blue light strips embedded in the ceiling. Nobody explained where we were going. Nobody ever did. We were led into a wide chamber I had never seen before, circular, with high stone walls that curved upward into darkness. The floor beneath our feet was smooth and worn, as if countless feet had walked across it before us. I realized, with a slow and uncomfortable understanding, that this was the arena. I had heard whispers of it from other captives, a place where disputes were settled, where champions fought for the entertainment and judgment of the Vraxil nobility. Guards positioned us along the outer wall, forcing us to kneel while nobles filed into balconies above, murmuring among themselves. I caught sight of Grace a few positions down the line, her face pale but composed. Beside her, a man I did not recognize kept glancing nervously toward the center of the arena floor. Then trumpets sounded, deep and mechanical, and the great doors on the far side of the chamber slid open. A delegation walked through, unlike anything I had seen among the Vraxil. Taller, sharper in their movements, dressed in uniforms so clean and precise they looked almost unreal. Their leader wore no obvious rank markings, yet every Vraxel guard in the room straightened at his presence, as if his authority needed no announcement. This was the Kesh envoy. I felt the temperature in the room seem to drop, though I knew that was only my imagination working against me. The envoy's eyes swept across the arena floor, across the kneeling captives, across the nervous Vraxel nobles in the balconies, and settled finally on the raised platform at the far end where Queen Aelthara now stood, flanked by her own guards. She looked smaller from this distance, but she did not look afraid. Not anymore. Whatever fear I had seen in that broadcast the day before had been folded away, replaced by something colder and more controlled. The envoy spoke, his voice carrying easily across the silent arena, without need for amplification. "Queen Aelthara," he said, "the Dominion offers terms." "I am listening," she replied. "Your fleets are broken. Your sixth ring has fallen. Continued resistance serves no purpose beyond delaying the inevitable and increasing the cost paid by your people. And your terms?" The envoy paused, and I had the distinct impression he was enjoying this moment, drawing it out for effect. "Full surrender of the Vraxel Empire, dissolution of your military, transfer of all territories to Dominion administration." A murmur ran through the balconies above, quickly silenced by a sharp gesture from one of the Queen's guards. "And the people," Aelthara said, "what becomes of them?" "They will be processed according to Dominion standard," the envoy answered, and something about the flatness of his tone made my skin crawl in a way I could not fully explain. I did not know what processed meant, and judging by the tension rippling through the nobles above, neither did they. Nobody who had gone through a Kesh conquest ever seemed to describe what came after in any detail. It was as if the details themselves had been erased, along with everything else. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, her gaze sweeping across the arena, across the balconies, across her own trembling nobles, and finally, across us, the captives, the kneeling, chained, voiceless people who had no stake in this war except to be swept along by whichever side controlled our chains. "There is a tradition," Aelthara said slowly, "among my people when terms of surrender are contested, a trial by combat, one champion from each side, deciding the outcome before the eyes of both empires." The envoy's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening. "Your empire is in no position to contest anything, Queen. And yet," she said, "the tradition remains. Refuse it, and you admit the Dominion fears a fair contest more than it fears continued war." I realized what she was doing. She was not trying to win the war on that arena floor. She could not. But she was trying to buy something, time, dignity, perhaps simply the right to lose on her own terms rather than have defeat handed to her like a verdict already written. The envoy exchanged a glance with the officers beside him, and after a long, tense silence, he inclined his head slightly. "Very well. Trial by combat. Choose your champion, Queen Aelthara. Ours has already been chosen." A path opened through the Kesh delegation, and a figure stepped forward, broad and still, dressed in dark armor that seemed to absorb the light around it, rather than reflect it. He did not speak. He did not need to. Every line of his posture radiated the calm, practiced confidence of someone who had fought and won more times than he could count. Queen Aelthara turned to her assembled generals in the balcony, and I watched, along with everyone else in that vast stone chamber, as one by one they looked away. Nobody volunteered. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until it felt like the entire arena was holding its breath. The Queen's shoulders remained straight, but I could see, even from where I knelt in chains, that something in her was breaking under the weight of that silence. Not fear this time, something closer to grief, as if she already understood what that silence meant, for everyone in this room, for every captive kneeling on the cold stone floor, for every world that had trusted her family's crown to protect them. I do not fully understand, even now, what made me stand up. Maybe it was the anger I had felt the night before, listening to Grace describe the terrifying silence that followed every Kesh conquest. Maybe it was the memory of the Queen's eyes drifting toward the captives during that first broadcast, as if searching for something, or someone, she could not yet name. Maybe it was simply the stubborn, unreasonable refusal that had been passed down to me from every generation of my family before me, the kind of refusal that does not calculate odds before deciding whether a fight is worth having. Whatever the reason, my chains rattled against the stone floor as I rose to my feet, and the entire arena turned to look at me. Silence is a strange thing. It can feel empty, or it can feel full, pressing against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. The silence that followed me standing up was the second kind. Every eye in that stone chamber, Vraxil guards, Kesh officers, kneeling captives, all turned toward me at once, and for a moment I almost sat back down out of pure instinct. I did not. A guard nearest to me stepped forward, weapon raised, ready to force me back to my knees, the way he had done to a dozen others before me. Queen Aelthara raised her hand, a small gesture, but it stopped him instantly. "Let him speak," she said. The Kesh envoy's expression shifted for the first time since he had entered the arena, something close to amusement flickering across his sharp features. "Your champion, Queen Aelthara, a captive, unchained property, kneeling among the rest?" "I did not choose him," she said, and I heard something careful in her voice, as if she was measuring every word before releasing it. "He chose himself." The envoy laughed, a short, cold sound that echoed strangely off the high stone walls. "The Dominion does not fight slaves. Choose again, or forfeit the tradition entirely." I felt the weight of every gaze in that arena pressing down on me, and I understood, with sudden clarity, that if I did not speak now, this moment would close forever. The Queen would be forced to choose someone else, likely a soldier who had already calculated the odds and found them impossible, and this small, strange chance I did not fully understand yet would slip away. "I am not her slave," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I am a prisoner of your war before it ever reached me. I did not ask to be captured. I did not ask to be sold. But I am asking, right now, to fight." The envoy studied me the way a predator studies something it has not decided is worth chasing yet. And why would the Dominion agree to face something so far beneath its champion? "Because if you refuse," I said, echoing words I had heard the Queen use only minutes earlier, though I gave them my own shape, "you admit that even a chained man from a species you have never bothered to name frightens you more than an army you have already beaten." A murmur rippled through the balconies above, and I saw several Vraxil nobles exchange startled glances. I did not know if what I said was clever or simply foolish, but it worked. The envoy's jaw tightened, and something in his posture shifted from amusement to something closer to irritation. "Very well," he said. "Let it be recorded across every feed in this war. The Dominion's champion against an unnamed prisoner of an unlisted species." Queen Aelthara stepped down from her platform, moving across the arena floor with a measured grace that silenced every remaining whisper in the room. She stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the fine details of her pale features, the deep blue of her eyes, the tightness around her mouth that suggested exhaustion far beyond what any single night of poor sleep could cause. "What is your name?" she asked, quietly enough that only I could hear. "Ethan Caro. Ethan Caro," she repeated, as if testing the shape of it. "Do you understand what you have just volunteered for?" "Not entirely," I admitted, "but I understand what happens if nobody volunteers at all." Something flickered across her expression, gone before I could name it. She turned to a nearby guard and spoke a quick command in her own language. Moments later, my chains were unlocked, the cold metal falling away from my wrists for the first time in 6 months. I rubbed at the raw skin beneath, trying not to let the sudden lightness in my arms distract me from the much heavier weight now settling across my shoulders. "You will be given 1 hour to prepare," the envoy announced to the arena. "The match will proceed under Dominion combat regulations. No weapons beyond what is provided. No interference from either side once the match begins." The guards led me away from the arena floor, through a narrow passage into a small chamber lined with training equipment I did not recognize. Strange metal frames and unfamiliar tools clearly designed for Vraxel or Kesh physiology rather than mine. Grace was allowed to follow, along with a stern-looking Vraxel officer named Lucas Bryant, one of the few guards who had never treated the captives with open cruelty. "You have lost your mind," Grace said the moment we were alone, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to admiration. "Do you even know what that thing is capable of?" "No," I admitted, "but I know what happens if the Dominion wins without a fight. You told me yourself." Silence. Nothing left behind, not even a memory of what came before. Grace's jaw tightened, but she did not argue further. Instead, she began helping me prepare in whatever small ways she could, tightening straps on the simple protective gear the guards provided, checking the weapon options laid out on a nearby table. Lucas Bryant watched from the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You should know," he said finally, "the Kesh champion has fought in over 200 recorded matches. He has never lost." "Then I suppose I'll be the first thing that changes today," I said, though my confidence sounded thinner than I wanted it to. "This is not bravery," Lucas said. "It is recklessness." "Maybe," I said, "but recklessness is the only thing I have left that nobody has taken from me yet." He studied me for a long moment, then walked further into the room, lowering his voice. "The Kesh fight with precision. Every movement calculated, every strike measured against probability. It is how they have conquered a dozen systems without losing a single champion in open combat. Then I won't fight the way they expect." "You have no training," Lucas said. "No weapon experience beyond whatever your species uses for labor and survival." "Exactly," I said, and for the first time since standing up in that arena, I felt something steady settle inside my chest, an idea forming out of nothing more than desperation and stubbornness. The Kesh calculate probability. They have never had to calculate someone who refuses to follow probability at all. Grace looked between the two of us, her expression uncertain. "That's not exactly a strategy, Ethan. It's the only one I have." The hour passed faster than I wanted it to. I selected a weapon closest to something I understood, a long metal staff with a weighted end, similar enough to tools I had used during years of cargo work that my hands remembered the balance of it instinctively. Grace helped me secure the last of the protective gear, her hands steady despite the worry clearly written across her face. "If you die out there," she said quietly, "it changes nothing. The war continues either way." "I know," I said. "Then why are you doing this?" I thought about the Queen's expression during that first broadcast, the way her eyes had drifted toward the captives as if searching for something she could not name. I thought about the silence Grace had described, the terrifying absence of anything left behind after a Kesh conquest. I thought about every captive kneeling on that cold stone floor, waiting for someone else to decide their fate without ever being asked what they wanted. "Because somebody has to stop assuming the outcome is already decided," I said. "Even if it's just for one afternoon, in one arena, in front of people who have already given up." Grace did not respond, but something in her expression softened, just slightly. The guards returned to escort me back to the arena floor. Queen Aelthara was waiting near the entrance, her expression unreadable in the way I imagined royalty was trained to master from birth. "The Dominion champion is named Vorin Kesk," she said, walking beside me toward the arena entrance. "He has served the Dominion's military caste since childhood, engineered specifically for combat efficiency." "Engineered?" "The Kesh Dominion breeds and trains its champions from birth, for singular purpose," she explained. "Physical augmentation, neural conditioning, years of combat simulation before they ever step onto a real battlefield. Vorin Kesk has never lost, because he has never faced an opponent whose behavior could not be calculated in advance." "Then I suppose I have one advantage," I said. "I don't even know what I'm doing, which means neither does he." Aelthara studied me for a long moment as we walked, and something in her expression shifted, curiosity mixing with what looked almost like hope, though I suspected she would never admit to feeling something so fragile in front of her own people. "Why did you stand?" she asked quietly. "Truly, not the words you spoke to the envoy, but the reason underneath them." I considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I saw your face during the broadcast yesterday. Right before the feed cut out, you looked at the captives. Not your generals, not your advisors, us. I don't know why, but it made me think that maybe you understood something the rest of your empire had forgotten." "And what is that?" "That we're not just cargo waiting to be assigned to whoever wins." Something crossed her expression that I could not fully name. Sorrow, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the exhaustion of carrying a crown too heavy for someone as young as she truly was beneath all the ceremony and tradition. "My mother taught me that a crown means nothing," she said quietly, "if the people beneath it are treated as nothing. I have not always lived up to that lesson. Perhaps today, in some small way, I am trying." We reached the arena entrance, and the great doors slid open before us, revealing the vast stone chamber beyond, already filled once more with kneeling captives, watching nobles, and the still, silent figure of Voron Kesk standing at the center of the arena floor, waiting. "Whatever happens out there," Aelthara said, "know that you have already changed something today, simply by standing when everyone else remained silent." I did not have time to answer. The trumpets sounded again, deep and mechanical, echoing off the high stone walls, and the guards guided me forward, onto the arena floor, toward the champion who had never lost. Voron Kesk did not move as I approached, his dark armor absorbing the light around him, his posture radiating the calm confidence of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome of this fight and found himself victorious in each one. Up close, he was larger than I had realized from across the arena, easily a head taller than me, with the kind of stillness that suggested years of discipline rather than natural calm. "You should not have volunteered," he said, his voice flat and precise, carrying none of the mockery I expected. "This will not be close." "Maybe not," I said, gripping my staff tighter, feeling my pulse hammering against my ribs. "But it will be interesting." Something flickered across his expression, the faintest hint of confusion, as if my response did not match any pattern his training had prepared him for. It was small, barely noticeable, but I held on to it like a small flame in the darkness. The envoy's voice rang out across the arena, announcing the beginning of the match, and the great crowd of nobles, guards, and kneeling captives fell utterly silent, waiting to see whether the impossible was about to happen, or whether the war would simply confirm what everyone already believed to be true. Voron Kesk shifted his stance, weapon raised, calculating, waiting. I raised my staff, my hands trembling despite everything I tried to steady them with, and for the first time since I had stood up in that arena, I allowed myself to feel something other than fear. I felt ready. Voron Kesk moved first, and he moved fast, faster than his size should have allowed. I barely had time to register the shift in his stance before his weapon swept toward my side, a long curved blade that hummed faintly with some kind of energy charge running through its edge. I twisted away on instinct, the blade passing close enough that I felt the air pressure change against my ribs, and stumbled backward across the smooth stone floor. The crowd above made a sound, somewhere between a gasp and a murmur, the kind of noise a crowd makes when it expects a fight to end quickly, and instead finds itself surprised, even if only for a moment. I did not have time to think about the crowd. Voron Kesk was already moving again, his steps measured and precise, each one calculated to close distance without wasting energy. I recognized the pattern almost immediately, the same efficient economy of movement Lucas Bryant had warned me about back in the preparation room. Every strike he made was probability tested, every angle chosen for maximum effect with minimum risk. I swung my staff toward his exposed flank, testing his reaction, and he blocked it with barely any effort, the curved blade catching the weighted end of my staff and redirecting the force harmlessly to the side. He did not counter immediately. Instead, he simply watched me, studying, calculating, waiting for a pattern to emerge that his training could exploit. That was his weakness, though I did not fully understand it yet. He needed patterns. He needed probability. Every fight he had ever won had been decided the moment his opponent settled into a rhythm predictable enough for his calculations to overtake. I refused to give him one. I swung wide, then abandoned the swing halfway through, dropping low instead and sweeping the staff toward his legs. He adjusted, stepping back rather than blocking, clearly unwilling to commit fully to a counter against an unfinished movement. I used the opening to close distance rather than retreat, driving the blunt end of my staff toward his chest. He caught it, of course, his reflexes far superior to mine in every measurable way, but I saw something flicker across his expression as our weapons locked together, close enough now that I could see his eyes clearly for the first time. Confusion. Not fear, not yet, but the faint, unmistakable confusion of someone whose calculations had just produced an answer that did not match reality. He shoved me back with far more force than I expected, sending me stumbling across the arena floor, and I barely regained my footing before his blade swept toward me again, faster this time, less measured, as if he was adjusting his approach to compensate for whatever unpredictability I represented. The crowd's murmur grew louder, and somewhere above, I caught a glimpse of Queen Aelthara, standing perfectly still at the edge of her platform, her expression unreadable, but her attention absolute, as if she had forgotten, for just this moment, every other burden resting on her shoulders. I ducked under Vorinkesk's next strike, feeling the humming energy of his blade pass close enough above my head that the hair on my scalp seemed to rise in response. I drove my shoulder into his midsection, an ugly, unrefined movement that had nothing to do with any formal combat discipline and everything to do with years of hauling cargo crates twice my body weight through zero-gravity conditions. He staggered, just slightly, but it was enough to buy me a half-second to reposition, to swing the weighted end of my staff toward the side of his knee, aiming for the joint, rather than anything armored. Contact landed harder than I expected, and he dropped to one knee with a grunt of surprise that echoed strangely across the silent arena. For one suspended moment, nobody in that chamber made a sound. Then Vorinkesk rose again, faster than I anticipated, his expression no longer calm. Whatever calculations his training relied upon had clearly failed to predict this outcome, and I understood, with a sudden surge of both fear and clarity, that an opponent who no longer trusted his own calculations became far more dangerous, not less. He came at me with a series of strikes I could barely track, each one faster and less measured than the last, abandoning the careful economy of movement he had shown earlier in favor of raw, aggressive pressure. I blocked what I could, dodged what I could not, felt the humming edge of his blade catch against my staff hard enough to send a jarring shock up through my arms. I stumbled, caught myself, stumbled again, retreating across the arena floor as he pressed his advantage. My arms ached, my legs burned, and somewhere in the back of my mind a small, exhausted voice reminded me that Vorinkesk had fought in over 200 matches and never lost, while I had never fought in a single one. But I had survived worse than this. Not combat, not exactly, but the kind of grinding, relentless difficulty that came from years of hard labor, of accidents on cargo ships that nearly cost me fingers or worse, of the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that exhaustion meant defeat. I let him press forward, let him believe the fight was tilting entirely in his favor, and then, when his next strike came in high and fast, I dropped low instead of blocking, sliding across the smooth stone floor beneath the arc of his blade and driving the weighted end of my staff upward into the gap beneath his raised arm. The impact staggered him badly this time, sending him stumbling sideways with a sound of surprise that carried clearly across the silent arena. I scrambled to my feet immediately, staff raised, chest heaving, and watched as Vorinkesk turned back toward me with an expression that had finally, completely, abandoned its earlier confidence. "You should not be capable of this," he said, and for the first time, his flat, precise voice carried something close to genuine confusion. "Neither should you be capable of losing," I answered, my own voice ragged with exhaustion. "I guess today is full of surprises." He came at me again, and this time I recognized something new in his approach, a kind of desperate improvisation entirely unlike the calculated precision he had shown at the start of the match. His training had prepared him for opponents who followed patterns, who could be predicted and countered with mathematical certainty. It had never prepared him for someone who refused to follow any pattern at all, who moved on instinct and stubbornness rather than strategy. I ducked, twisted, absorbed a glancing strike against my shoulder that sent pain radiating down my arm, and used the momentum of my own stumble to drive the weighted end of my staff toward his ribs. Contact landed solidly this time, hard enough that he doubled over, and I did not hesitate, driving my knee upward into his midsection with every remaining ounce of strength I had left. Voron Kesk collapsed to the arena floor, his blade clattering from his grip across the smooth stone, and for a long, suspended moment, the entire chamber held its breath, waiting to see whether he would rise again. He did not. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had experienced before, heavier than the silence before the match had begun, heavier than the silence following the Queen's broadcast the day before. It was the silence of an entire arena, an entire empire watching through countless broadcast feeds, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. I stood there, chest heaving, staff still raised, staring down at the champion who had never lost, now lying still on the arena floor beneath me. My arms trembled from exhaustion, my shoulder throbbed where his blade had caught me, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a small, exhausted voice kept repeating the same simple, impossible fact. I had won. The Kesh envoy stepped forward from among his officers, his expression unreadable, though I noticed his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. He studied Voron Kesk's motionless form for a long moment before turning his attention toward me, and something in his gaze carried a weight I had not expected, not quite anger, not quite respect, but something uneasy sitting between the two. "This changes nothing," he said finally, his voice carrying across the silent arena. "One match does not decide a war." "Maybe not," I said, still catching my breath, "but it decides something." Queen Aelthara stepped down from her platform once more, moving across the arena floor with the same measured grace she had shown before, though something in her posture had shifted, straighter now, as if a weight had lifted even slightly from her shoulders. She stopped beside me, studying Voron Kesk's still form, before turning her attention to the envoy. "The terms of the match were clear," she said. "My champion has won. What say the Dominion?" The envoy's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, clearly aware that every eye in that arena, every camera feed broadcasting across a dozen conquered systems, was watching to see how he would respond. Finally, he inclined his head slightly, though the gesture carried none of the respect such movements usually implied. "The Dominion honors its traditions," he said. "Terms of surrender are suspended, pending further negotiation." A sound rose through the balconies above, disbelief mixing with something that might have been the first genuine hope this arena had witnessed in longer than I could imagine. Guards who had stood rigid with fear only an hour earlier now exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to celebrate or simply remain silent, waiting to see what came next. I felt my legs finally give out beneath me, exhaustion catching up all at once, and I dropped to one knee on the cold stone floor, staff clattering from my grip. Grace appeared at my side almost instantly, along with Lucas Bryant, both of them helping me steady myself as the adrenaline that had carried me through the fight began rapidly draining away. "You actually did it," Grace said, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. "I genuinely did not think you would survive that." "Neither did I admitted, my voice rough with exhaustion. Lucas Bryant studied me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something close to respect replacing the guarded neutrality he had shown earlier. 200 matches, he said quietly. He had never lost a single one, until today. I did not have the energy to respond, my body finally registering the full extent of what I had just put it through. Every muscle ached, My shoulder throbbed where the blade's edge had caught me, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion, a strange, disbelieving relief was beginning to settle in. The slow realization that I had actually survived something I had genuinely believed might kill me. Queen Elthara knelt beside me, her expression carrying a weight I had not expected from someone who ruled an empire, something raw and unguarded that I suspected she rarely allowed anyone to witness. "You have no idea what you have just done," she said quietly. "I have some idea," I said, managing a tired, crooked smile. "I bought us time." "You bought us far more than time," she said. "You have shown every world watching this broadcast that the Dominion is not invincible. That belief alone is worth more than any single battle." I looked past her, toward the balconies above, where nobles who had refused to volunteer only an hour earlier now watched with expressions caught somewhere between shame and renewed hope. I looked toward the kneeling captives along the arena's edge, their chains still binding them despite everything that had just happened, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity I did not fully understand yet. I had won a single match. The war was far from over. But something in that arena had shifted today, something I did not yet have the words to describe, and as the guards helped me rise to my feet, I understood, with a growing certainty that settled deep into my exhausted bones, that this fight was only the beginning of whatever came next. They moved me to a private chamber within the palace that night, far from the cold stone cells where I had spent the last 6 months. It should have felt like a victory: clean sheets, warm light, a door that no longer locked from the outside. Instead, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying the match over and over until exhaustion finally dragged me under. I woke to the sound of raised voices outside my chamber door, sharp and urgent in a way that pulled me instantly upright, every muscle tensing before my mind had even fully cleared. I reached the door in time to see 2 palace guards restraining a third figure, someone dressed in Vraxil military uniform, struggling against their grip with a wild, desperate energy that seemed entirely wrong for the disciplined culture I had witnessed since arriving. "Loyalist to the surrender faction," Lucas Bryant explained, appearing beside me with his expression tight and alert. "There are those within our own military caste who believe continued resistance only delays an inevitable defeat and costs more lives in doing so. He attempted to reach your chamber." The realization settled over me slowly, cold and unwelcome. Someone within the Queen's own palace had tried to have me removed, quietly, before I could become any further complication to a surrender many still believed was the only sensible outcome. "Is the Queen safe?" I asked. "For now," Lucas said, "though I suspect this will not be the last such attempt. You have become far more than a single victory in an arena, Ethan Caro. You have become a symbol, and symbols attract enemies from every direction, not only the ones wearing Dominion uniforms." I was escorted to a war council chamber deep within the palace shortly after, a circular room lined with strategic displays showing star systems, fleet positions, and territorial boundaries I did not fully understand. Queen Elthara sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by generals whose expressions ranged from cautious respect to open skepticism. "Sit," she said, gesturing to an empty chair near her own. "You have earned a place at this table, whether my generals agree with that decision or not." Several of the assembled officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but none voiced open objection, at least not yet. I took the offered seat, still feeling every ache from the previous day's fight settling into my bones. "The match bought us time," Elthara continued, addressing the room. "But time alone does not win a war against an enemy with superior numbers, superior technology, and a proven record of conquest across a dozen systems. We require a different approach." "Your traditions have already been tested," one of the generals said, an older Vraxil officer with deep scars across his face that spoke of decades in active service. "A single champion's victory changes public perception, but it does not change fleet capacity, weapon superiority, or the fundamental military reality we face." "I am aware of the reality, General Voss," Elthara replied, her tone carrying an edge that silenced further objection. Which is precisely why I have called this council. We require a strategy the Dominion has never encountered before, in the same way Ethan Caro's fighting style proved unpredictable to their champion. All eyes in the room turned toward me, and I felt the weight of expectation settle uncomfortably across my shoulders. I was no military strategist. I had spent my life hauling cargo between mining stations, not commanding fleets or planning campaigns. I don't know anything about your fleets, I admitted, or your weapons, or your tactics. No, Iothara said. But you understand something. My generals have spent their entire careers unlearning. You understand how to fight without following predictable patterns. I thought about the match, about the moment Voron Kesk's calm confidence had shattered, the instant my movements stopped conforming to any strategy his training had prepared him for. I thought about Lucas Bryant's warning in the preparation room, that the Kesh calculated probability, that their entire military doctrine relied upon predicting and countering conventional tactics with mathematical precision. Your fleets fight the way he fought, I said slowly, the idea forming even as I spoke it aloud. Structured formations, calculated engagements, probability-driven strategy. That's exactly the kind of warfare the Dominion has spent years perfecting counters for. And what would you suggest instead? General Voss asked, his tone skeptical, but no longer dismissive. Chaos, I said. Not reckless chaos, but the kind that comes from refusing to follow any single predictable strategy. Small, unpredictable strikes instead of large, coordinated battles. Targets they don't expect, timing they can't calculate. Retreats that look like weakness until they become traps. The room fell silent, several generals exchanging glances that carried a mixture of confusion and reluctant curiosity. You are describing guerrilla warfare, Iothara said quietly. A concept my people have never needed, given the scale of our traditional military engagements. My people have needed it for most of our history, I said. Every conflict where one side had fewer resources than the other, guerrilla tactics were how the smaller side survived long enough to change the outcome. It's not about matching the Dominion's strength, it's about making their strength irrelevant. General Voss leaned forward, studying the strategic displays lining the chamber walls with newfound interest. Our fleets are not equipped for such tactics. Our training does not prepare officers for unstructured engagement. Then perhaps, Iothara said, it is time our training changed. The council continued for hours after that, plans forming and dissolving and reforming as generals argued over logistics, resource allocation, and the fundamental risk of abandoning centuries of established military doctrine in favor of something entirely unproven. I contributed what I could, drawing on fragments of history I remembered from countless stories about human conflicts, uprisings against superior forces, resistance movements that had survived against impossible odds through nothing more than stubborn unpredictability. By the time the council finally adjourned, exhaustion weighed heavily across every face in that chamber, but something else had settled alongside it, a fragile, cautious sense of possibility that had not existed before I stood up in that arena. Iothara found me afterward in a quiet corridor overlooking the palace gardens, the first moment of true privacy we had shared since the match. She looked smaller somehow, without the weight of her court surrounding her, more like the young woman she truly was beneath the crown and ceremony. My generals do not trust this strategy, she said. Many of them do not trust you either. I don't blame them, I said. I'm not exactly the obvious choice for a war advisor. No, she agreed, but you were the only one who stood when everyone else remained silent. That counts for something, even among generals who prefer tradition over instinct. We stood in silence for a long moment, watching the last light of evening fade across the palace gardens below. Why did you look at the captives? I asked finally, during that first broadcast, before any of this happened. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, because I understood, even then, that whatever decision I made regarding the Dominion's surrender terms would affect them most severely of anyone in this empire. My nobles would find new positions under Dominion rule, perhaps diminished, but survivable, My generals would likely be executed or imprisoned, but they had chosen a life of risk when they joined the military caste. The captives, however, chose nothing. They were simply swept along by circumstances entirely beyond their control, the same as every conquered world absorbed into the Dominion's silence. And now? Now, she said, turning to face me directly. I find myself hoping that same silence might finally be broken, not through superior force, but through the same stubborn refusal you showed in that arena. A refusal to accept that the outcome was already decided before the fight even began. Word of the match had spread faster than any single broadcast feed could account for, carried through channels I did not fully understand, whispered between conquered worlds still technically under Dominion administration, shared among resistance movements that had assumed all hope of opposing the Dominion had long since been extinguished. Grace found me late that evening, her expression carrying an excitement I had not seen from her since our earliest days as fellow captives. "You have no idea what's happening out there," she said, practically breathless. "Systems that surrendered months ago are reporting unrest, workers refusing Dominion administration orders, small acts of resistance popping up across territories everyone assumed were completely pacified. Because of one match? Because of what that match represents," Grace said. "For as long as anyone can remember, facing the Dominion meant accepting inevitable defeat. You didn't just win a fight, Ethan, you broke something people believed was unbreakable." I thought about Voron Kesk's expression as he lay on that arena floor, the genuine confusion in his voice as he questioned how any of this had been possible. I thought about the Kesh envoy's tightened jaw as he announced the suspension of surrender terms, clearly unable to fully hide his own uncertainty in that moment. The Dominion had built an empire on the foundation of inevitability, the quiet, crushing belief that resistance was always ultimately pointless. That single belief had conquered a dozen systems more effectively than any fleet or weapon ever could, and now, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, that foundation had cracked, however slightly. News arrived 3 days later that shattered whatever fragile calm had settled over the palace since the match. Dominion reinforcements were mobilizing, a fleet far larger than the one that had originally breached the Sixth Ring, moving with clear intent toward the Vraxil homeworld itself. The Kesh envoy's earlier warning echoed uncomfortably in my mind. One match does not decide a war. Whatever hope had bloomed across conquered systems in recent days, the Dominion clearly intended to extinguish it quickly and decisively, before that hope could spread any further. Queen Aelthara called an emergency council the moment the reports arrived, and I found myself once again seated at that long table, surrounded by generals whose earlier skepticism had hardened into something closer to grim determination. "They intend to make an example of us," General Voss said, studying the fleet movement projections with a tight expression. "A demonstration to every system watching that resistance, however inspiring, ultimately changes nothing against overwhelming force. Then we give them something they cannot calculate a response for," I said, and I felt every eye in that chamber turn toward me once again, waiting. "You have a plan," Aelthara said. It was not a question. "I have an idea," I said. "Whether it becomes a plan depends on whether your generals are willing to abandon everything they've been trained to believe about how wars are supposed to be fought." General Voss studied me for a long moment, his expression carrying the weight of decades spent commanding fleets according to established doctrine that had failed against the Dominion's superior numbers time and again. "Speak," he said finally. "We are listening." I looked around that table, at generals who had spent their entire careers preparing for conventional warfare, at a young queen carrying the weight of an empire on the edge of collapse, at the strategic displays lining the walls showing an incoming fleet larger than anything the Vraxil military had faced before. "Then let's give them a war they've never seen before," I said, "one built entirely out of everything they've never had to prepare for." The next 6 days passed in a blur of preparation, unlike anything the Vraxil military had ever attempted. General Voss, despite his early skepticism, proved to be exactly the kind of disciplined mind the new strategy needed, translating my fragmented ideas about unpredictable engagement into workable tactical structures his officers could actually execute under pressure. We abandoned the traditional fleet formations entirely. Instead of massing our remaining ships into a single defensive line the Dominion's superior numbers could simply overwhelm, we split our forces into small, independent strike groups, each operating without centralized coordination that enemy sensors could track and predict. Every group received different objectives, different timing, different approaches, ensuring that no single captured transmission or intercepted strategy could reveal the full shape of our resistance. Grace proved unexpectedly valuable during this period, her 3 years of captivity having given her detailed knowledge of Dominion administrative patterns from systems she had passed through before arriving at the Vraxil Palace. She helped identify supply routes, communication relay points, and administrative centers that Dominion forces relied upon but rarely reinforced heavily, assuming their reputation alone would deter any resistance. "They've never had to defend these positions," Grace explained, pointing toward a series of marked locations on the strategic display. "Every system they've conquered simply surrendered outright. Their supply and communication infrastructure was built for administration, not combat." "Then that's exactly where we hit first," I said. "Not their fleet directly, the systems keeping that fleet supplied and coordinated." Lucas Bryant, who had been assigned to lead one of the smaller strike groups, studied the plan with a mixture of nervousness and growing confidence. "This goes against everything our training has emphasized: direct engagement, overwhelming force where possible, structured retreat when necessary." "Structured retreat is exactly what they expect," I said. "We're not giving them anything they expect." The Dominion fleet arrived at the edge of the Vraxil home system 4 days later, an overwhelming force stretching across sensor displays in numbers that made several generals visibly pale despite their earlier resolve. Queen Althara stood before the assembled war council one final time before the engagement began, her expression carrying the same steady resolve I had first glimpsed in that arena, when she had knelt before a stranger rather than her own throne. "Once this begins," she said, "there is no possibility of retreat or renegotiation. The Dominion has committed overwhelming force specifically to eliminate any further inspiration our resistance might provide to other conquered systems. We either succeed today, or this empire and everything it represents ends permanently. Then we make sure we succeed," I said. The battle began not with a massive fleet engagement, but with silence. Our largest visible formation, a deliberately obvious defensive line, positioned exactly where Dominion sensors would expect traditional resistance, remained still and quiet as the Dominion fleet advanced, exactly as planned. It was bait, nothing more, designed to hold their attention while our smaller strike groups moved into position across supply routes and communication relays scattered throughout the outer system. I watched from the Palace Command Center alongside Queen Althara and General Voss, strategic displays showing the slow, methodical advance of Dominion forces toward what they believed was our primary defensive position. Tension coiled tight in my chest, the same nervous energy I remembered from standing in that arena, waiting for Vorin Kesk's first strike. "Strike groups reporting position," an officer announced from a nearby console. "All groups ready on your command, Your Majesty." Althara glanced toward me, and I understood the weight of that look immediately. This strategy had been my idea, built from nothing more than instinct and fragments of history from a species the Dominion had never bothered to properly catalog. If it failed, the consequences would extend far beyond a single lost battle. "Execute," she said. What followed unfolded faster than the strategic displays could properly convey. Small strike groups striking simultaneously across a dozen scattered positions, disabling communication relays, disrupting supply convoys, targeting isolated support vessels the massive Dominion fleet had never bothered reinforcing heavily. Confusion rippled visibly through Dominion formations as their overwhelming numerical advantage suddenly found itself unable to coordinate effectively, unable to calculate a coherent response to threats appearing simultaneously across positions their sensors had never flagged as vulnerable. Dominion communication network showing significant disruption, the officer reported, his voice carrying growing excitement. Their central fleet is losing coordination with support elements. General Voss studied the shifting displays with an expression I had not seen from him before, something close to genuine astonishment. They cannot adapt quickly enough. Their entire command structure relies upon centralized coordination between fleet and support elements. Without that coordination, they're just a large collection of ships with no coherent strategy, I finished. The Dominion's primary fleet, still advancing toward our deliberately exposed defensive position, began showing signs of hesitation, their formations slowing, as commanders clearly struggled to determine how to respond to disruptions occurring simultaneously across positions they had never anticipated needing to defend. It was exactly the opening General Voss's officers had been waiting for. "Second wave, engage," Althura ordered. Our remaining fleet elements, previously hidden among asteroid formations and debris fields the Dominion sensors had dismissed as strategically irrelevant, emerged suddenly across multiple flanking positions, striking not at the Dominion's strongest concentrations, but at the edges of their formation, where confusion and lost coordination had already created vulnerabilities. It was not the kind of overwhelming victory traditional military doctrine promised. It was something messier, more chaotic, built entirely from unpredictability rather than superior force. I watched the battle unfold across those strategic displays for hours, tension never fully releasing from my chest, despite the increasingly favorable reports flowing in from across the engagement. Dominion forces, so accustomed to inevitable victory through calculated overwhelming force, found themselves consistently unable to adapt to threats that refused to follow any predictable pattern. By the time the Dominion commander finally signaled full retreat, pulling back the remaining fleet elements rather than risk further losses against a strategy they clearly still did not fully understand, the sun had nearly set beyond the palace windows, and every officer within that command center stood in stunned, exhausted silence. "They're retreating," the reporting officer said, disbelief clear in his voice. "The Dominion fleet is retreating." Queen Althara did not celebrate immediately. Instead, she remained still for a long moment, studying the strategic displays showing Dominion forces withdrawing from the system, as if she needed to fully absorb the reality of what had just occurred before allowing herself to believe it. "This is not the end of the war," General Voss said quietly, though something in his tone had fundamentally shifted from the grim resignation he had carried only days earlier. "The Dominion possesses resources to mount further engagements." "No," Althara agreed, "but it is the end of their inevitability. They have learned, today, that victory is not guaranteed simply because their numbers are larger." I felt exhaustion finally settling over me, the same bone-deep tiredness I remembered from the moment Voronezh collapsed on that arena floor, the sudden absence of adrenaline, leaving nothing behind but relief and disbelief in equal measure. The following weeks brought changes I could not have fully anticipated when I first stood up in that arena. News of the Dominion's retreat spread across conquered systems even faster than word of the arena match had, and the quiet, resigned acceptance that had settled over territories under Dominion administration began cracking in ways the Dominion clearly struggled to contain. Small acts of resistance grew bolder. Administrative centers reported increasing difficulty maintaining order. Systems that had surrendered months earlier began quietly reaching out to the Vraxil Empire, seeking guidance, seeking hope, seeking confirmation that the impossible victory they had heard rumors of was genuinely real. The Kesh envoy returned to the Vraxil homeworld nearly a month after the battle, though this time his posture carried none of the confident authority he had displayed during his first visit. He requested formal negotiations, not surrender terms, and Queen Althara received him in the same arena where everything had first changed, though this time the chamber held no chains, no kneeling captives, no auction blocks waiting to determine anyone's worth. "The Dominion proposes a formal ceasefire," the envoy said, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that had replaced his earlier condescension. "Territorial boundaries would remain as they currently stand, pending further negotiation between our respective governments." And the captives, Aelthara said. Every prisoner currently held across Dominion-administered systems, taken from worlds that never consented to conquest. The envoy's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not immediately refuse. The Dominion would consider reviewing individual cases. No, Aelthara said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Full release. Every captive, from every conquered system, returned to freedom or repatriated according to their own wishes. This is not a point open for further discussion. I stood near the edge of that arena floor, watching the exchange unfold, and felt something settle deep in my chest that I had not expected to feel again after everything that led to this moment. Hope, not the fragile, desperate kind I had clung to during my 6 months of captivity, but something steadier, something that finally felt like it might survive beyond a single battle or a single negotiation. The envoy studied Aelthara for a long moment, clearly recognizing that whatever leverage the Dominion once held over these negotiations had fundamentally shifted since their fleet's humiliating retreat. Finally, he inclined his head, the gesture carrying, for the first time, something that resembled genuine respect rather than reluctant formality. "The Dominion agrees to your terms," he said. "Full release of captives, effective immediately across all administered systems." The following days brought a flood of activity across the palace, unlike anything I had witnessed since my arrival. Ships arriving from distant systems carrying freed captives returning home, administrative teams working to coordinate the largest release of prisoners in recorded memory, and amid it all, Grace, Lucas Bryant, and countless others I had come to know during my months of captivity, finally stepping into freedom they had genuinely believed might never come. Queen Aelthara found me one final time in the quiet corridor overlooking the palace gardens, the same spot where we had spoken following that first War Council meeting. "You could return home now," she said. "The Dominion has agreed to full repatriation for any captive who wishes it." I considered her words carefully, watching the gardens below where several freed captives were gathered, laughing together in a way I had not heard since long before my capture. "I think I'd like to stay," I said finally, "at least for a while longer. This war isn't fully over, and I suspect there's still work to be done, convincing people that resistance isn't as pointless as the Dominion spent years convincing everyone it was." Aelthara studied me for a long moment, something warm and genuine crossing her expression, entirely different from the careful, measured composure she had shown during our earlier conversations. "When you stood in that arena," she said, kneeling among the other captives, refusing to accept that the outcome had already been decided, you changed something far larger than a single battle. You reminded an entire empire, and countless conquered systems beyond it, that inevitability is simply a story powerful enough forces tell to convince everyone else that resistance is pointless. "It's not always pointless," I said. "Sometimes it just needs someone stubborn enough to stand up first." "Then perhaps," she said, "that stubbornness is exactly what this empire, and every system still living under the shadow of Dominion conquest, needs most going forward." I looked out across the palace gardens one final time, watching freed captives reunite with families they had believed lost forever, watching Vraxil soldiers who had once enforced chains now standing guard over gates that finally opened rather than closed. The war was far from finished. The Dominion still held territory across countless systems, and whatever peace we had won today remained fragile, uncertain, built from a single unexpected victory rather than any guarantee of lasting change. But for the first time since chains had first closed around my wrists, I allowed myself to believe that the future remained genuinely unwritten, that no empire, however vast, however seemingly inevitable its conquest appeared, could ever fully extinguish the simple, stubborn refusal of people who chose to stand rather than kneel. I had come to this world as cargo, as property auctioned beneath a throne I never asked to serve. I was leaving that arena, and everything that followed, as something else entirely, not a hero, not exactly, but proof that even the smallest voice, rising from the most unlikely place, could still change the shape of an entire war. And somewhere across those countless conquered systems, word continued to spread, carried between worlds that had long since given up hope of anything changing. An empire had stood at the edge of total defeat, its queen prepared to accept whatever terms an unstoppable enemy demanded, until one voice, from the most unexpected place in that entire arena, had simply refused to stay silent. That refusal had changed everything.